at the ZomBee HarmonoChorus Beetronics. Those of you familiar with Beetronics are probably aware of kind of the upward wavelength that they've been on recently. Beetronics originally kind of made a name for themselves as the creators of visually striking, great sounding drive and fuzz pedals. But over the years have gotten a little bit more intricate and ambitious about the circuit designs as well as the visual aesthetics of their pedals. This came to a head in a lot of ways with last year's release of the ZomBee by Beetronics, a octave fuzz with about 1,000 other bizarre esoteric features shoved in there as well. It is a great sounding drive, it's a great sounding octave fuzz, and you heard it on that intro, that crazy octave thing at the end of that song was the ZomBee. But we're not here today to talk about the ZomBee. We are here to talk about the ZomBee. This is their stereo MIDI capable HarmonoChorus. And HarmonoChorus may sound like a made-up word, but that's because it is. What you have here is essentially two distinct approaches to chorus in one pedal. And as you can tell by the face here, this thing looks a lot more complicated than I actually think that it really is. So let's talk about what this thing is capable of doing. This can be your traditional two-knob chorus if you want it to be. It can be a variety of fascinating and weird ramping-based choruses as well. It can be a great stereo widening tool, and it also can be a quantized arpeggiating pitch shifter with both predictable and random arpeggiating patterns. And you can also MIDI clock all of it, just in case you were wondering. Pretty much all the striking stuff that you heard on that intro jam, the kind of octave down craziness notwithstanding, was generated inside of this thing. All the chorus sounds, any double tracking sounding parts, that stereo widening in this thing, that arpeggiating thing during kind of like the verse section of the song, also this guy. So let's talk about what this thing does. You basically have 3 switches and 3 knobs on this thing with secondary controls for all 3 knobs up top. At its base level, you can kind of divide this pedal in half. You have a chorus mode and a harmono mode. In chorus mode, you have those Bucket Brigade delay chips being modulated by an LFO to create a sine wave chorus. That chorus can be mono, it can be traditional chorus stereo, dry on one side, vibrato on the other, or an out of phase kind of faux stereo setup that gives you more of that kind of drifting back and forth through the stereo field chorus effect. And within that, you have 3 modes along the bottom. You have a roto, a depth, and a sting, which basically allows you to either ramp the speed, the depth, or this really fascinating kind of third option where there is no LFO controlling the delay time of the BBD chips. And instead, you use rate and depth to set 2 different delay times, and you can ramp between them. You also have incredibly useful sub-menu controls on all 3 knobs for tone, mix and a feedback on the delay, which will allow you to create some really cool flanging sounds as well. When you jump over to that Harmono mode on this thing is where you get into some really bizarre stuff. It takes that LFO that is modulating your Bucket Brigade delay chip speed and kind of takes it from that sine wave to a hard square wave, adjusting the speed in precise musical intervals. And your depth control becomes a series of 12 stepped control options along that depth control that will basically allow you to choose between progressively more complicated with progressively more steps of intervals. So you're basically picking chord structures that get divided up into their individual parts, and the LFO kind of jumps between those pitches. In that side, you have a dual, an ARP, and a MAD mode. Your dual is basically going to let you set 2 different chord clusters and 2 different speeds and ramp between the 2. Your ARP mode is going to allow you to pick one of those chord clusters and then go through using the submenu on the ramp side to pick a pattern. So this is going to be predictable, replicatable, and again, MIDI clockable patterns of stepping up, stepping down, or stepping up and down through that arpeggiated chord cluster. And then thirdly, you have MAD, which is basically just a collection of literally thousands of random patterns that chord structure will step through. If this doesn't make sense, it's because it will later, I promise. There's a long menu for this thing, and if I'm being honest, the face of a Beetronics pedal is not always the most useful interface you've ever worked with. The art is beautiful. The clarity is a little bit lacking. So there's a good solid manual that this thing comes with that I highly recommend you check out. But when we get into our sound samples, I think we do a pretty good job here of really breaking this thing down into its individual elements and kind of slow walking through all of the sections. So I'm gonna put time codes for basically every aspect of this pedal in the description down below. So if there's any specific part of this thing that you're curious about or really want to try to get your head around, that will be kind of your shortcut so you don't have to sit through however long this video ends up being. I guess the final note before we get into our sound samples is the fact that it just sounds damn good. I feel like sometimes in the process of trying to explain what's happening here, you can lose the plot on what is important, which is, does this thing sound great? And the answer, as you heard from that intro song, is of course it does. The Beetronics guys don't miss. The ZomBee is a ridiculously cool pedal. The Royal Jelly is phenomenal. And this is a really strong new showing from the Beetronics crew. It is a great sounding chorus, and it does a hell of a lot more than that. So let's get into it. Before we get into our sound samples, let's go ahead and talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Bunting Melody Queen T into the Cali 76 compressor, the Benson Germanium Boost, the Benson Preamp, the Beetronics ZomBee. From there we go to the SeaBee in stereo and out to the Strymon's Timeline and Big Sky, and then out to our amplifiers, which are the GFI Dream and, the UA Dream and Ruby as a kind of parallel blend inside of the GFI Duophony. We are going to be using basically the Cali 76, the Benson Germanium Boost, and the Big Sky as kind of like a nice subtle plate reverb for the entirety of these samples. So guitar into those 3 effects sounds like this. So let's get into the SeaBee. Like we've discussed, this is a harmonic chorus or a HarmonoChorus because there's a lot of harmonizing that happens in this thing. But it can be a very simple and straightforward chorus pedal. So we're going to start with that. Because the face of this thing can look so immediately overwhelming and kind of seems like it obfuscates a lot of what can be done with this pedal, we're going to divide it up into really manageable chunks. So the most important thing to understand about this thing at the outset and understanding kind of the control scheme on the face is the 3 colors that you have to be paying attention to. This kind of light blue can be considered as kind of your base level control scheme, and that's your rate, your ramp, your rate, and your depth. So this is your kind of like essential world for chorus sounds, and then this is the rate at which you ramp between kind kind of your A position and your B position in any of the ramping things this thing is capable of. Beyond that, you have your Harmono mode on the left and your chorus mode on the right. When you're in Harmono mode, this dark blue is going to be representative of what the controls on each of these things do as a secondary control. And in the chorus side, it's going to be these white and tan labels. So while we're in chorus mode, this toggle right here will kind of correspond to those lower labels, being your roto, your depth, and your sting. And likewise, in chorus mode, when you press and hold your bypass switch, turn on that yellow LED to kind of get into your alternate controls for these guys, all three of these to a certain extent. You have control over, in chorus mode, your feedback and your filter or your EQ controls, basically your tone controls, and your mix. Mix is going to be universal, by the way. Mix is going to be accurate for both modes. And then in your harmonic mode, this is going to be your harmonizer, and this is going to be your pattern. So we'll get into that stuff when we get into it. That's some of the more kind of like chaotic stuff in this pedal, but that's the basic control scheme. This is going to be your tap tempo or your ramp. This is your bypass or access to your alternate controls. Together, it's going to let you scroll through presets. And then this is going to be your ramp control, whether it ramps from A to B and holds at either position, ramps up and down evenly, or saw waves up and then drops hard back off with that ramp control. Now, if that seems like a lot of information, that's where we're about to kind of carve this thing up into really manageable bite-sized pieces. So let's get to our right position on this bottom toggle, our chorus mode. So again, dry tone. So we're currently in Roto mode, and basically these three toggle positions are basically what you are ramping with this ramp control along the left side of the pedal. Roto ramps your rate, depth ramps your depth, for those of you who took media literacy, and sting is the interesting one, where there is no, just so you can hear it, the sting mode has no kind of like LFO running. You can hear that stereo widening of the pedal because we're at a stereo chorus pedal. But you'll notice there's no actual chorusing happening. And that's because you're ramping the bucket brigade delay time between the A and B positions on your ramp. So you're only getting that chorusing effect when you are actively ramping in that third mode, which is really interesting. But let's get back to kind of Roto, our most standard basic thing. So in order to kind of find our way to that basic chorus sound that you kind of want to like start with for this thing, let's actually start with those secondary controls in that chorus mode. So press and hold that bypass switch, that'll turn yellow. And now we are dealing in our tone control, our mix, and our feedback. So pretty straightforward. That center one is going to be your mix. And when you get all the way out, it's fully wet, which makes it more of a vibrato. Let's make the chorus a little bit more pronounced for the sake of this. So you can hear we are definitely in vibrato mode right now. Then as you dial that back, you start getting back into that stereo chorus world. And let's take it back to that fully wet vibrato mode. And take a look at over here, this tone control. So at the bottom, it's basically divided up into these pizza slices. This dark, light, dark, light. This first section is going to be bypassed, so no tone filtering happening at all. And you hear it mute for a second, and now we are in a high pass. Less low end being filtered, or less low end passing through. And now we're in a band pass. And now low pass. They're all fairly subtle, but kind of do some really kind of like practical use case stuff. Like if you just want a kind of sparkly chorus sound, you can kind of you can have that by just kind of going to that low pass. And now your low end isn't being processed through the chorus nearly as strongly. Versus this. And similarly, now you have a much darker chorus. Can also be really useful for bass players who want a little bit of that warble, but only on the treble or only on the bass. Okay, let's go back to no filtering, and let's take a look at this feedback control. In chorus mode, this is going to get really interesting because it won't feed back on its own, like it won't oscillate, but as you dial it up, you will get flanging sounds out of it. So now slow that back down. So those are the sub-menu controls in that chorus mode. Let's take that oscillation back out. And now we have like a nice straightforward, let's go back into it, get that mix nice and high. And yeah, basically filtering off low regen and high mix. And now you can kind of set whatever kind of bass level, like 2-knob chorus you want. So let's talk about the ramping stuff. If you have that ramp control at minimum, it bypasses the tap tempo. Because, oh yeah, by the way, this is also a tap tempo. So let's turn up the ramp and allow us to kind of fast chorus. Or a slow chorus. But if you minimize it, so by the way, what you just heard is, like I said, we are currently in Roto mode, which affects you set your rate from your 2 different positions, and the rate is a subdivision of, or the ramped rate is a subdivision of your main rate. So like if we tap in a nice slow ramp, and then jump. You notice that the ramped one is now slower than what it was earlier. Whereas if we give it a little bit more speed, when we ramp, we get into those like really extremes. And the reason it's latching right now is because we're in that leftmost position. Let's slow our ramp down. And you can really get that kind of drag very slowly if you're careful with it. Conversely, in that center position, you can get it so that it ramps only while you're holding it, and when you release it, it ramps back down at the same rates. Or you can do a sawtooth, where it immediately snaps back to position 1, which I think actually has like a lot of really cool uses. And like I said, in this center position, you're now ramping your depth control. So now let's jump over to depth mode, which basically ramps to and from 0 depth to kind of wherever you have your depth set. So if we go super deep with that depth control, so you can hear that we are ramping to 0 basically on that depth control. So again, this is a great opportunity for... Oh, and you can invert it, by the way, by double tapping this right foot switch. So now our bass level is going to be no depth. And then it introduces it and then removes it. So you can actually create some like really bizarre, interesting textures and make it pretty immediate. And there's actually some really interesting kind of practical, non-noise rocky use cases, in my opinion. Like a nice subtle chorus. Let's double tap so that we are in our actual chorus by default really quick. So dial up like a nice, pretty chorus sound. Then double tap so that we're back to kind of a baseline of 0. With rate and depth not moving at all, this thing does function as a really great double tracker, like mono guitar. Versus So you can actually kind of get something where you've got like that kind of already just kind of baseline double track. And then when you want it, turn it into a chorus pedal. And then back out. Which can be really cool because there's a lot of interesting use cases for that, including if you like do something really like chaotic and weird with like the ZomBee. Reverse it. Just like a hair of like added vibrato, and you can kind of like screw with that by fighting with your own vibrato kind of manually. Yeah, there's some really unique, interesting, weird things that can be done in this depth mode. Okay, and let's wrap up this section by taking a look at that sting mode. So there is no LFO running in sting mode like we previously talked about. You basically set the rate for your bucket brigade chip at time 1 using the rate control and time 2 using the depth control. So you can hear you're actually like physically modulating the delay time. We'll come back to why I just did that in a second. So you've got and so in between those, let's take our reverb out really quick. You then set your ramp speed and you ramp between them. You can hear a little bit of that. What's really interesting here is reintroducing that feedback control. And the reason for that is you get a way more pronounced version of this effect. Almost like a really cool melting effect, which can be really cool if you dial in something like a big, let's reduce that just a hair, keep it from self-oscillating. If you introduce something like a really big, wide stereo delay, double tap to invert that process. Ramps up now. Something really cool there, just like subtle texture choices that you have access to. And like I said, you could physically ramp that with an expression pedal or MIDI or anything else if you wanted to. Some really cool stuff can be done there. Okay, one final thing to note on the chorus side as we kind of transition into the Harmono side of this pedal is in the global configuration stuff, there is a stereo image effect control. So when you power this thing up, you can unplug, and as you add power to it, you hold down your bypass switch, everything will flash. And then there's a myriad of things you can do, including configuring your multi-jack and some other stuff. But the thing that I did just now, as we kind of move into the next section, is switching using this right toggle right here to go from kind of traditional stereo image, dry on one side, modulated vibrato on the other, basically classic stereo chorus. And instead, we have now jumped over to kind of what they call like fake stereo or wannabe stereo in this pedal, at least, which is basically phase inverted, where the wet signal is on both sides, but it's out of phase with one another. So you kind of hear it bounce back and forth. So we've been hearing that kind of like hard panned stereo chorus thing the entire time. But now we have. Which is definitely more my speed, but also not the like traditional application of stereo chorus and not the factory default, which is why we kind of like ran through the previous stuff in that mode. But and it's worth saying, you get a way more convincing flanger in this mode. Yeah, you hear it. So with that having been said and everything, let's jump over to the Harmono side of this pedal. Okay, let's jump into the more complicated, insane side of this thing and see how we can go about demystifying the Harmono side of the chorus pedal. It actually is pretty straightforward once you get down to it. Harmono versus chorus. Chorus is, of course, just an LFO modulating a bucket brigade delay chip in a very smooth fashion. It just waveforms up and down like that. Harmono is basically taking that speed change, that kind of constant changing speed of the bucket brigade delay chip, and quantizing it to basically like exact pitches. So instead of that kind of like wavy, slow moving thing, you have. You can hear it's much more of a square wave than it is a sine wave at this point. But what's interesting here is it's not just that it's a sine wave, it's a sine wave or a square wave that is being quantized to seconds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, and octaves. And that's really interesting. Let's start in dual mode, where essentially you have your rate, or you have your ramping control, and your sub control is going to be your EQ still. Your rate, which your sub control is going to be your mix still, and your depth, which is now going to be a selection of 1 to 12 in terms of different chord patterns that you can pull from, different kind of chord structures. And the manual has the list of what all 12 of them are right here. We're not going to bother getting into that because there are 12 of them and they're in the manual. But suffice to say, they start simple and work up to kind of bigger and more complicated clusters of harmonies that come out as you play. So down low, you're going to get pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Basically just a second in an octave. But as you go, you get into progressively more aggressive, longer strings, bigger chords, more complicated chords, that kind of thing, as they kind of like step through the various pitches. And it's also worth noting that because this is an analog BBD chip, being digitally controlled in terms of its speed, whenever it pitches in a direction, it has to kind of pitch from that direction to the next spot. So it doesn't go unity pitch, up a second, and then down a fourth from unity. It would go up a second and then down a fourth from a second, that kind of thing. So it is worth knowing that that is factored in. So you're going to get kind of like these really interesting patterns as a result of that. In dual mode, you're essentially setting two different rates and two different sets of harmonies, and you can ramp between them. You also have that feedback control, which is worth remembering. So like down low, you're going to get low feedback and these kind of really like plinky. But then you can start changing that character by introducing feedback. And this thing will runaway oscillate, of course. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So that is dual mode. Where this thing gets really fun on this Harmono side of the pedal is going to be as you step into Arp, because you are now selecting your chord over here. And then your sub control on this goes from that tone control to one of 12 patterns that control how the notes from that chord. Again, we pick a chord and it's going to have like the intervals from this list that you are kind of like stepping between, but you are now then selecting in turn from all of these patterns that basically can let you choose like a linear step up, linear steps up and down, linear steps down only, that kind of thing. So like patterns nice and low. Let's go with like a kind of like a more harmonically rich, more steps on this side. So you've got like a, let's slow it down a little bit so it can really kind of like hear us walk through that steps and give it a little bit more juice. But then you can kind of start. Oh, whoops, we gotta jump back into this. So a good rule of thumb here is this first cluster is going to walk up. The second one is going to mostly walk down. And then you're going to get up and down, interesting. Oh yeah, and worth knowing, let's get back out of that. In this mode, your ramp is basically going to be from 0 depth to whatever chord cluster you're in. So kind of like, so you can slow roll it in. Super interesting. And then your third mode here is going to be the same thing, except the mad mode is all random. So all of these patterns over here, they're all going to be random. It's and it's like literally thousands of options, which is really wild. It's like you go to 12. You feel like you got a little bit of a handle on what's happening there. And then you roll away from it. You go back. Totally different pattern. What's really cool here is grabbing something like the digital delay in the timeline at full wet. Filter wide open, grit way down so it's nice and clean. And then getting a nice wide. What I also really like is these swell modes on the timeline for this kind of thing.